The screechers? Yeah. The screecher awakens in her nest. Is that what it is? And listens to the night world. The nest has hard, flat sides that smell of trees, and an open top. She is wrapped in warmth that makes her heart slow, her breathing calm. How full she is! How good it is to finally eat what her body seems to know it needs. She has seen two kinds of animals thus far in her short life. One is fur-covered and winged. He perches close, watching her with wide eyes. He is different in many ways. But he is more like her than the other animals she has met. They are tall and clumsy in their movements, always making strange noises, sweet highs, and gruff lows, and long exhalations. Whatever they are, they haven't hurt her. The first time they'd reached...
Humans.
It is humans, you're right. And what was the first creature she saw? Was it...
The honey.
The hummingbird, yeah. Specifically, Willodeen's hummingbird, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The first time they'd reached into her nest, she'd recoiled. Wetness was there. Water. She'd had no idea how thirsty she was.
And I can tell you, if you want to learn how to draw a hummingbird, I can tell you. Just draw a bill and then draw wings on the bill.
Hummingbird wings on it?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. The first time they'd reached into her nest, she'd recoiled. Wetness was there. Water. She had no idea how thirsty she was. More? More came. More and more. Then food, green, brown, wet, alive, dead. All wrong. She'd waited. Patience had served her well so far, and then there it was, the right food at last. If she keeps eating, she may survive. If she survives, she may learn how to be whatever she is meant to be. Being alive takes all the energy she can muster, but it seems to be full of possibilities. Full of possibilities. She will take her time. She will hope. She will rely on others, on these strange animals who study her so carefully. She has no other choice. Nearby, the red-furred animal, the food-bringer, is sleeping. On her pillow is the small flying beast. He opens one eye and lets out a soft trill. The screecher returns his gaze. She replies with a sound that's new to her, a grumbly purr. The flying beast goes back to sleep. Moonlight pours in the pools in the nest. Night is when another kind of sound happens, but she's not ready for that. Not yet.
What is it?
I don't know. We'll just have to guess until they tell us. Chapter 28. Connor and I spent the next morning trying to unearth more peacock snails. He brought the knife he used for cutting reeds, and I borrowed a trowel from May and Bertie's garden. After 2 hours, 3 cuts, several scraped knuckles, and endless holes, we had only 8 snails to show for our efforts. It looks so easy when the screechers do it, I said, stretching my weary arms. No matter where we dig, it ends up being the wrong place. Wait a minute, Connor exclaimed. His smile got lopsided when he was excited. Maybe that's the answer. What if we let Quinby do the digging? The very thought made me panic. But what if she runs off? What if a hunter sees her? I have an idea, Connor said. Give me an hour. By noon we were back at the cottage with the strange contraption Connor had created out of reeds and willow branches. As soon as we entered, Duzu had fluttered over to Connor's shoulder, and Quinby poked her head over the side of her crate, her snout quivering. "Well, what have we here?" May asked, looking up from her never-ending knitting. "It's a harness," I said, "for Quinby. At least, we hope it is." I placed Quinby's peacock snails on a plate, and she ate them in a flash. She sent me a hopeful look. "Sorry, girl," I said, "that's all we could find." "We're going to let Quinby do her own hunting," Connor explained. "I like your thinking," said May. "First, we had to get Quinby into the harness, and that was a tall order. Her claws were already longer and sharper. Gingerly, I picked her up by the scruff of her neck, the way a mother dog would hold a puppy. With Connor, May, and Bertie all working at once, we managed to slip the harness over Quinby's head and ease her 2 front paws through the holes. I found some rope, and Connor tied it to 2 loops that he'd made on top of the harness. "If that isn't a ridiculous sight," said Bertie, "but an ingenious one." We let Quinby roam the cottage so she could get used to the harness. She moved around like a tin soldier, her legs stiff, trying in vain to grab the rope with her teeth. She was clearly not happy with us. "I really don't want to do this," I said. "It doesn't feel right, having a wild thing tied up. But if she were to run away, I don't know what to do, or what I'd do." I frowned. "We're hoping she'll be able to scent out peacock snails better than we can." "Not to mention dig them," Connor added. Connor had brought his basket, and we loaded Quinby in that, along with May's blanket. The basket had 2 handles, so we each took a side, and Connor held the rope as well. I put my coat over the top, and off we went. We passed a couple of people on the road, but nobody said a word, and Quinby thankfully was fairly quiet, although she poked her nose out a couple of times to take in the exciting new smells. By the time we reached the hidden grove where we dug that morning, Quinby was making eager squeaking noises and scratching at the sides of the basket. "I wonder what she's thinking," Connor said. "Me too," I said, "probably trying to figure out what the ridiculous humans are up to." We slid her out of the basket. Quinby blinked, stunned. She looked up and down and all around. She pulled on her rope to get close to the willow roots. Then she went to work. If you've ever seen a dog bury a bone or a spotted green chipmunk rooting for a lost acorn, you will know what I'm talking about. Quinby clawed near those trees with utter certainty. She'd reach her goal. Every so often she'd stop to sniff the ground, her snout quivering, and every time she dug she found a treasure trove of peacock snails. Dozens upon dozens. "She knows exactly where to dig," I said. "Their sense of smell is amazing." "And their actual smell," Connor joked. "When screechers were invented, Mother Nature had made them scented." I laughed. "I've never heard that before. My pa would have liked it." It was strange hearing myself say "pa" out loud. I couldn't remember the last time I had. "I made it up just now." Connor tightened up his grip on Quinby's rope. "I've actually been trying to write a story about Quinby, about how she must feel, and how she came to be." He gave an embarrassed smile. "It's not very good." "I doubt that," I hesitated. Maybe, I could read it someday?" "I still don't know how it ends. I don't even know much about her yet." That's what I like about watching screechers, trying to figure all that out. Like your ma with the birds, I suppose. I cast a sidelong glance to see if I'd made a mistake bringing up Connor's ma, but he was smiling, same as me. "She would have liked you, I think," Connor said, "my mother." I bet I would have liked her too. He scratched his forehead, looking bemused. "You know, it's funny, I don't think I've talked to anyone about my mother in years, except maybe my father, and hardly even then." "I know what you mean." I stared at Quinby so Connor wouldn't see the tears forming in my eyes. It's tough for most folks to understand unless they've gone through it. We didn't say anything more. We didn't have to. What do you think Willodeen was thinking about, Apollo?
Her dad.
Yeah, and her mom, her family, yeah. While Connor watched Quinby dig and eat, I pulled out my notebook and jotted down anything and everything. I walked around the 5 willows, trying to count the number of peacock snails Quinby ate. She definitely seemed to prefer 2 trees in particular. I felt the dirt, the twirling leaves, using my feet. I measured the distance from the willows to the stream, meandering downhill. "What are you looking for?" Connor asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I never do. I just have the feeling that the looking will lead me to the right questions, and maybe even the right answers." I worked on quietly. The only noises were the rustle of the leaves, the scrabbling of Quinby's claws, and the stream talking. Silence filled with sound. It was... Well, we let Quinby eat until she looked over at us. Her belly was swollen, her eyes glazed, and gave a contented belch. I wasn't certain how to tell if a screecher was happy, but I was pretty sure we carried one home that afternoon. Chapter 29. Every morning after that, Connor and I took Quinby back to the same spot. She quickly got used to the harness, which we removed as soon as she was safely back in the cottage. In fact, she seemed to associate it with snail hunting, and sat calmly as we slipped her into it. Most days, Duzu joined us. He always rode on Connor's shoulder. Sometimes they talked to each other, one with words, one with coos, and I would just listen along. Quinby was growing so fast that Connor decided to make a larger harness. We'd had to switch to a wheelbarrow covered with a tarp because she was too heavy to carry in the basket. Her tusks were sharper. Her tail quills were no longer soft to the touch. She drooled a bit, growled sometimes, and just generally looked less like a cute baby and more like the frightening animal she was meant to be. Still, Quinby never screeched at night. I often wondered why. She'd also become more flexible about her diet. We'd gradually begun to add more foods, especially grubs and ferns, to her plates, and she would eat them when she ran out of peacock snails. But the snails were still clearly her favorite food. One morning, Connor and I went uphill to find the dragon size kicking up whirlpools of dust. "Fire weather," Connor commented, and then he looked troubled. "Sorry," he said. "No, it's all right. We never talk about the fire that killed my family." But Connor knew what had happened. "It must have been awful," he said. "It was, but awful things happen to lots of people." True. Our conversations were often like that. Just a handful of words, and I liked it. The silences were comfortable as an old sweater. Walking in the forest with Connor was almost like walking alone. Like me, he was calm and watchful, although we were searching for different things. Connor was always on the lookout for petals and stones, reeds and cattails. I was always searching, unlikely as I knew it was, for more screechers. And of course, we both kept our eyes open for any humming-bears. By the time we reached the hidden grove, Quinby was working hard to escape the wheelbarrow. As soon as we let her out, she dashed to a blue willow, nearly toppling me in her hurry. Duzu, as always, sat on Connor's shoulder, preening himself. When he began cooing loudly and persistently, even Quinby turned to see what the commotion was about. "I've decided Duzu makes 3 distinct noises," said Connor. "One for yes, one for no, and one for maybe." "Which one is that?" I asked Connor. "Oh, that's yes for sure," he said. "That's a very noisy yes." "Calm down, Duzu," I chided, but his coos only grew more spirited. He craned his neck, and I followed his upward gaze. There, settled into luminous bubbled nests, were 3 humming-bears. "Connor," I whispered, pointing. "Look!" He gasped. "I can't believe it! They're the first ones I've seen in ages!" Duzu made a noise. "Well, except for you, of course." "Poor Duzu," I said. "I wish he could join them. It's not fair." "Lots of things aren't fair," Connor said, and I wondered if he was thinking about his ma, or maybe about my family. We stared at the nests reflecting the sun, each one a little miracle. The humming-bears murmured to each other like doves. "But why are they here?" I asked. We haven't seen any by the riverfront. That's where they always used to migrate. There aren't any in those new groves they planted either. One of the humming-bears chewed a yellow leaf. After a few minutes, he blew a glistening, perfectly round bubble, about the size of my palm. Carefully, he added it to the top layer of his nest. "It's amazing the way the bubbles stick to each other," said Connor. "And to the tree," I added. "But not to humming-bear fur. It must be something about the leaf sap. I wish I understood it. I'd love to make my puzzler pieces hold together like that." "The bubbles are strong, too," I said. "I found one in the ground once and tried to pop it, and I couldn't do it." "Does Duzu ever make bubbles?" "He used to," I said. "He doesn't bother much any more. I guess my pillow is the nest now." I reached over to stroke Duzu's head. "I sure wish I knew why they've chosen this spot." "Maybe because it's so secluded," Connor suggested. "Could be that humming-bears don't like crowds any more than you do." I smiled. "But in years past, crowds didn't bother them, and they don't seem to mind that we're here. With a screecher, no less." I chewed on a thumbnail, considering. "We've brought Duzu a few times. I suppose his scent might have attracted them." We waited until Quinby had eaten her fill of the snails, then headed back to the cottage. Duzu, still on Connor's shoulder, chomped on the willow leaf as we walked. We were halfway down the hill, with Quinby dozing happily in the wheelbarrow, and when I heard noises in the trees to my right, I caught the glint of a rifle barrel. 3 men crashed through the brush, and one of them was Otwell Borwan, carrying his bow with a quiver of arrows at his ready. We froze. "Well, if it ain't the Screecher girl," said Otwell. He sauntered over, blocking our path forward. "What's in the barrow?" I silently begged Quinby to stay still. "Smells like something ripe," said his friend with the shotgun. "Could be a screecher," said the other. I swallowed past a lump in my throat. About an inch of Quinby's tail was poking out from the tarp. "Well, as you know, I always smell like screecher," I said as casually as I could. Connor took a step forward. "Actually, it's manure," he said. "We've got plenty more than we need. Want some?" "Dung and screechers," Otwell lip curled. "Perfect company for you, girl." He backed up a couple of paces, and he took the opportunity to swerve the barrow past the 3 men. "You still owe me an arrow," Otwell called, but we were already rushing down the hill. "That was close. Next time we might not be so lucky," Connor said as we neared the cottage. "We can't do this forever, Willodeen." "I know," I said, panting. "I keep thinking we'll figure everything out." We wheeled the barrow to the back of the cottage and let Quinby leap out. "My father's going to be thrilled to hear about the humming-bears," Connor said. "If more show up, maybe the fair will actually happen after all." "Connor," I said, "do you think maybe... could we wait just a few days or 2 before we say anything about the humming-bears?" "Why? Everyone will be so relieved." "I know. I just feel like there's something I need to figure out. There are all these pieces, and if I can only look long enough... I know, it doesn't make sense. I can't explain it." "Sounds like my puzzlers," he said. "Sometimes you just have to give ideas room to breathe." "One day," I said. He nodded. "Sure." "Come on, Duzu," I said, holding out my arm. Only then did I notice the little bubble he'd blown. It was oddly shaped, but he clutched it in his paws, looking quite pleased. When he let it go, we watched it float on the air, impossibly strong, impossibly lovely. Chapter 30. I woke that night to a horrible sound, a full-throated screaming into the blackness. Screecher loud. Only it wasn't a screecher. It was me. May and Bertie rushed into my room. Bertie held a flickering candle. They perched on my bed, each taking a side. Duzu moved to my lap. and Quinby watched from the crate she'd nearly outgrown. The wind toyed with my lace curtains. "Fire dream again?" asked May. I nodded. In my head it was still there, the flames grabbing for me like a hungry monster, the soles of my feet blistering, the poisonous smoke scorching my lungs. I looked at Bertie and May and asked the question, the one I'd asked 100 times before. Why? I sobbed, and then I found my voice. Why did I make it out when they didn't? They knew I meant my ma and pa and brother, and I knew what they were going to say, what they always say. No one knows why, Willodeen, but we are so glad you did. I hated that answer. I wanted adults to make sense of the world. I needed them to promise I would always be protected, even though I knew it was impossible. I yearned to hear, and they all lived happily ever after. No one knows why. Well, why not? I wanted to scream. And yet, despite all that, part of me welcomed their honesty. Bertie and May were grown-ups who weren't afraid to admit they didn't have all the answers. It was scary, but it has also sparked something inside me I couldn't explain, a feeling that maybe I could find the answers I needed, even if they couldn't. I looked into the main room where embers still glowed in the hearth, soothing and necessary. Fire could look so harmless and be so deadly. The wind surged. I leaned my head on May's shoulder. "Do you smell smoke outside?" "No," said May. "No," said Bertie. "And even if you do, don't forget, Willodeen, that not all wildfires are started by people. Sometimes they're nature's way of cleaning out a forest to make room for new growth." "I didn't know that," I admitted. "That's something you might learn more about if you went to school now and again," said May. I groaned, and May held up her palms. "Just a thought. Keep in mind that while we may seem like bottomless fonts of knowledge," said Bertie with a wry smile, "even May and I have our limitations." She nodded at Quinby. "With our screecher friend, for example, I'm afraid we haven't been of much use to you." As clouds moved past the moon, Quinby shifted. She tilted her head back, mouth open, and for a moment I thought she was going to attempt an actual screech. But no, it was just a yawn. "What do you think will happen to Quinby?" I asked. Again, I received no answers, just wistful smiles and warm hugs. "Whatever happens, we'll be there to help you, you Willodeen," May said. "We love you more than life itself. Do you understand that?" I knew I should have said something then. "Thank you. I love you too." Instead, I just stroked Duzu and gave a quick nod. "Do you want us to stay until you fall asleep?" Bertie asked. "No, thanks," I said. "I have Duzu and Quinby." I sniffed the air. "You're sure you don't smell smoke?" "I smell screecher," Bertie replied, "and that is all I smell." I attempted a smile. "When screechers were invented, Mother Nature made them scented," I said. Connor made that up. "He seems like a good friend," May said. And then she kissed my forehead. Was he a friend? Had I made an actual friend? Me against all odds? After they left, I stared at Quinby, sitting there obedient as a pet dog. As out of place as I sometimes felt, how must she feel? "Why are you here, Quinby?" I asked. She replied with a snort, and I laughed in spite of myself. "Whatever am I going to do with you?" Another snort. I sighed. If the unthinkable could happen. "If your family could vanish in a moment, why couldn't a sculpture of a screecher come to life? If horrible things were possible, why not magical ones?" I closed my eyes, but I knew sleep would not be coming. Not when I could still hear the angry wind. Not when I'd seen the places dreams could take me. Chapter 31. The next day, Connor had to help his father with more setup for the fair, and then attend an afternoon council meeting. After I'd done my morning chores, I put Quinby in her harness, attached the rope, and loaded her into the wheelbarrow. "Quiet, girl," I warned, covering her with the tarp. By now she knew the wheelbarrow meant an adventure involving food, and she settled quickly. With Duzu on my shoulder, I headed toward the top of the ridge. I wanted to spend as much time as I could at the grove before word got out about the hummingbears. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the ornery part of me making trouble again. Maybe it was because the stand of blue willows had become a special place for Connor and me, and I didn't want to share even though I knew I had to. Well, this afternoon, I promised myself I would tell everyone about the hummingbears, no matter what. I thought I could manage the wheelbarrow without Connor, but I was sadly mistaken. It took all of my strength to make it up the hill, and I stopped several times to rest. With every pause, Quinby popped out her head to greet the world. When we finally reached the hidden grove, I tied Quinby's rope around a blue willow. Trunk. Good thing Pa had taught me how to make a nice solid knot when I was still young. Sweet coos drifted down, shading my eyes. I looked up to see not 3, but 7 hummingbears, each in a bubble nest. They now occupied 2 separate blue willows. The bubbles gleamed, slivering the sun like prisms. The hummingbears looked completely at home. 3 of them were dozing, 2 were grooming themselves, the other 2 were looking down at me, Duzu, and Quinby with intense curiosity. Quinby went to work, digging for her meal at one of her 2 favorite trees while I retrieved my notebook from the pouch. What was I looking for? What was I hoping to learn that I didn't already know? I pulled off a couple of blue willow twirls and gave them to Duzu. He ate one whole. Then he chewed the next one slowly and produced a perfect bubble. Meanwhile, Quinby excavated with an energy that was almost frightening. But that was, of course, her job, to stay alive, to be what she was meant to be. Poor Duzu would never be that lucky. He couldn't ever be totally free, completely himself. Could Quinby? For the next hour, I counted, I sorted, I noted, I sketched, I measured. Mostly, I wondered. Sometimes, I simply wondered what I was wondering about. Connor was right. We were doing the same thing, putting puzzle pieces together. He looked at nature and made art from it. I looked at nature and made sense of it. Tried to, anyway. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The air warmed. The wind picked up, angry and edgy. By now, Quinby had dug in several spots, but she'd focused almost all her energy on the holes near the 2 willows closest to the stream. The same trees where the hummingbears were nesting. I felt the soil near one of the holes. It was slightly damp. Soft dirt meant easier digging, at least. It did if you had a screecher claws. And she was still finding plenty of peacock snails and in fact, the deeper the hole, the more snails she seemed to uncover. But why had the hummingbears chosen the same 2 trees for nesting? Because they were a bit closer to the water. Huh? Maybe? Hummingbears weren't diggers. They wouldn't care if the soil was more porous. I examined the leaves on each of the 5 willows. They were in full autumn attire, vivid blue on one side, shiny silver on the other, twisting like ribbons on an enormous gift. I removed a leaf from each tree and laid them side by side, held down by stones to keep them from blowing away. Strange, the way hummingbears were so particular about what they ate and where they nested. A lot of creatures were more open-minded, it seemed to me. Take screechers, they nested wherever they could, and even picky Quinby had learned to eat more than just peacock snails. I thought of my brother Toby. When he was 1 1/2, he'd refused to eat anything but porridge for months on end. I remembered Ma groaning, "Give me strength," as Toby turned up his nose at anything but lumpy porridge. The more lumps, the better. It seemed like a bad idea, all things considered. If you were open to eating lots of different things, wouldn't that make your life easier? If you could nest anywhere, didn't that give you more chances to find a safe nesting and resting place? Pieces upon pieces, questions upon questions. I was getting nowhere. I gathered up my leaf samples and I placed them in my notebook, labeled with numbers from 1 to 5. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them. I could always give them to Duzu for a snack, although we tried to keep a good supply on hand. By the time we departed, Duzu had made 3 impressive bubbles, and Quinby was giddy full. I seemed to be the only one who left feeling disappointed. Why do you think she's disappointed, Apollo?
Because she promised herself that tomorrow that at the end of the day that she's gonna tell everyone that the hummingbirds are back.
Yeah, maybe. I think she's disappointed because she's trying to figure out this mystery of why the hummingbirds like that specific tree, and she can't figure it out. Didn't quite do it, even though she took all those notes. All right, next chapter. We'll see who's right. Chapter 32. I dropped Duzu and Quinby off at the cottage. May and Bertie were napping on their rockers. They looked so fragile, almost childlike. Gently, I covered them both with quilts. I chopped several logs, cleaned the henhouse, swept the front porch, and then I grabbed a trowel, tucked it into my waist pouch with my notebook, and headed down to the village. The meeting was still in session. I could hear the villagers talking, or was it arguing? Peeking around the half-opened front door, I caught a glimpse of Connor. He was sitting in his usual spot, sketching, while a red-faced man droned on and on. I waited, hoping Connor might look over and see me, but he seemed to be lost in another world. Down by the river walk, the willow leaves tangled in the fitful wind. Still no humming-bears. Clouds scudded through the pale sky. I took a deep breath. Was that smoke? Would I be asking the same question for the rest of my life? I took out my trowel and walked past each blue willow. Every now and then I poked into the soil at the base of the trunk. I'd never before tried digging for snails there, but almost every time I found some. More, in fact, than I'd ever seen. Entire villages of them. How Quinby would love to come here, I thought with a rueful smile. Of course, she couldn't. She'd be killed for the bounty, or chased off at the very least. I pulled a few leaves from several trees, ignoring the strange looks I got from passers-by. Then I made my way to the hillside, where the new grove of blue willows had been planted. The ones Connor's father had said needed more water. Sure enough, they seemed stunted and dry. I collected leaves from them, too. On my way back to the cottage, I took samples of the leaves from other kinds of trees. Oaks and purple maples, bitternuts and striped elms, May and Bertie, and striped elms. May and Bertie are still napping when I returned. Quinby greeted me with a polite snuffle. I checked my bed, where Duzu was dozing on my pillow. His 3 bubbles lay nearby, stuck together in the form of a triangle. A new bubble, still separate from the others, sat next to his right paw. It made me happy that he'd taken up bubble blowing again, something he would be doing in the wild. It was also quite convenient, since I needed to borrow a bubble. Returning to the kitchen, I pulled the sheet of paper from my notebook and tore it into pieces. On each scrap of paper, I wrote a number and a location: Hidden Grove 1, Hidden Grove 2, 3, 4, and 5. I took my samples from the riverside willows, the new blue willow grove, and the leaves I'd collected from the random trees. One by one, I laid them out on the kitchen table. Before them, I placed my 5 leaf samples from the hidden grove. Tiptoeing back to my bedside, I picked up Duzu's single bubble. Fortunately, he was a sound sleeper. I felt a tad guilty borrowing his creation, but I knew he could always make more bubbles. Back at the table, I started with the 5 riverbank willow leaf samples. I touched Duzu's bubble to the first leaf. The bubble and the leaf should have stuck together instantly, but they didn't. Same thing with the other 4 leaves. Next, I tried the new Willow Grove samples. The bubbles slid right off every leaf. I followed with leaves from the other types of trees. The same thing happened. That didn't surprise me. Pa had told me the bubble nests only stuck to the blue willow leaves. Still, I wanted to be sure. It was time for the Hidden Grove samples. Leaf 1, leaf 2, leaf 3, nothing. The bubble refused to attach. I was down to 2 more leaves. Numbers 4 and 5 were from Quinby's preferred trees, where she did almost all her digging. The trees where the 7 hummingbears' nests were situated. Gently I touched the bubble to the leaf 4. The bubble stuck. It was like fitting the right key into a stubborn lock. So she couldn't get the bubble to stick on any other tree, Apollo, except the ones that the hummingbears are in and the one that Quinby rooted in.
Dad, I'm toilet listening.
I moved the bubble, now trailing a leaf, to Hidden Grove leaf 5. Once again the leaf adhered, and once again I could not separate the bubble from the leaf. I stared at the table, covered with leaves and scraps of paper. I grinned, and then I got out my notebook, and I began to write as fast as my pencil would let me write. I wrote the same way Quinby had dug that morning, hungrily, with a sense of purpose, as if I was doing what I was meant to do. What do you think she's writing, Apollo?
I don't know.
Do you think she's writing about how the hummingbear bubble only stuck to the leaves that were from the trees that were preferred by Quinby? And even the other trees that were similar, it didn't stick to those leaves, those dry ones. So do you think maybe there's a relationship between screechers and hummingbears and those trees?
Yeah, because the hummingbear, because now that there's a screecher in the house, he always just follows the screecher around.
Yeah, so maybe they have some sort of symbiotic relationship that helps them all survive. So if you were to take one out of an environment, what would happen to the other one?
I don't know.
Well, if they depend on each other for survival, and you killed one, what would happen to the other one?
The other one would try to get killed.
Or would be killed or would go away, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's the problem in this book?
People are killing all the
They're killing the screechers, but they're also noticing what other creature has gone away.
The hummingbird.
The hummingbears. Yeah. So do you think maybe she's on to something? Maybe she's figuring out that the hummingbears are staying away because they took the screechers away. Yeah, and the screechers maybe make those trees special so that they are nice for the hummingbears.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think she's on to it. We'll see.
Yep.
Do you want to go on?
Yeah.
All right. Chapter 33. When I was done with my notes, I ran back to the village. I had to tell someone, and that someone was Connor. More than anyone, he would appreciate how I'd puzzled something through, how I might even have an answer to the village's hummingbear problem. Near the bottom of the hill, I saw Miss Rossett, the teacher, talking to Connor's father. "Hello, Willodeen," she said. I was surprised she remembered me. It had been ages since I'd been to school. "You certainly look excited," said Mr. Burke. "I figured something out," I exclaimed. "Something? Well, I think it might be really important." No sooner were the words out of my mouth than I could feel my face flushing. I looked down at the ground, instantly self-conscious. "Can you tell us more?" asked Miss Rossett. I started to answer, but then I looked back up at Miss Rossett. Her smile had faded to a look of alarm. The wind had kicked up yet again, and with it came an unmistakable smell. Smoke, she said, but of course I already knew. I checked the hills, trying to place the fire. Up there, I pointed to the round-top ridge where the train tracks were. The same place the last big fire had started. Another strong gust, and the fire burst into life. It was beautiful in its fury. The billowing gray smoke with its eddies and swirls, the red blood of flames moving slowly toward the village, the sparks and embers popping and fading like fireflies. I gulped, trying to quell the panic in my chest. My mother and baby are at home, said Miss Rossett, wringing her hands. I've got to check on them. Will you be all right, Willodeen? Yes. I think Connor's down by the river. I need to find him. Mr. Burke gripped my shoulders. Be careful, Willodeen. I will. Around us, villagers moved purposefully. Some ran toward the river, carrying buckets. Others had shovels and hoes. Despite the quickening flames, a calm determination filled the air. After all, we'd been through this before. I'd been through this before. The searing burns on my feet, my lungs scraped raw, the screams of my family. I needed to run, to hide, but where could I possibly be safe? And then it hit me. I didn't want to run away. I wanted to run toward Birdie, May, Juzu, Quinby. I had no time to waste. Spinning around, I raced back up the hill, to the cottage, to the place where everything I needed and loved could be found, to my home. Chapter 34. By the time I neared the cottage, May and Birdie were already heading down the road, calling for me. Willodeen! Birdie cried as she and May wrapped me in their arms. I wiped my stinging tears and pointed to Birdie's feet. You're only wearing one shoe. As soon as we smelled the smoke, we dashed out the door, May said, and I couldn't tell if she was laughing or crying. We weren't sure where you were. It doesn't matter now, said Birdie. We're all here. We're all safe. She nodded toward the round-top ridge. Same place as the last time. It's moving slowly, though, and veering east a bit. The cottage will probably be fine, unless the wind changes. Still, I'm worried sick about the folks over that way. I heard a frantic cooing sound and turned to see Duzu half fluttering, half running toward me. Duzu, I said, and he landed on my shoulder, rubbing his head against my neck. Oh, my! May slapped a hand onto her cheek. The door! We left it open! We all thought it, but no one said it. Quinby! I ran back to the cottage, with Duzu hanging on for dear life. May and Birdie trailed behind me. The front gate was wide open, so was the cottage door. Quinby! I yelled, my pulse hammering. Quinby! Her box was empty. The cottage was deserted. We checked the yard, the shed, every hiding place that we could think of. She's gone, I whispered. I suppose I figured if I said it quietly enough, it might not be true. She's probably just hiding in the woods, said May, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. I'm so sorry, love. All we could think of was getting to you. I patted May's back. It's not your fault. Maybe, said Birdie. She went up to the grove where you and Connor go. Maybe she went up to the grove where you and Connor go. Connor, I said. Mr. Burke was looking for him. My heart was tearing apart like a piece of wet paper. Uh-oh. Maybe Connor's up there. I wanted to protect May and Birdie and Duzu. I wanted to find Quinby. I wanted to be sure that Connor was safe. I'm going back down to the village, I said. I have to see if Connor is all right. You can't, May began, but I cut her off. I'll need water buckets, I said. You two stay here with Duzu. Keep an eye out for Quinby in case she comes back. Birdie and May exchanged a look that spoke volumes. I was the child, and they were the adults, but I was also healthy and able-bodied, and they were not. I could see they wanted to stop me, and I could see they weren't going to. If I can help, I want to try, I said. They both nodded. I'll come straight back here to fetch you if the fire changes course, I promised. "Take the buckets on the front porch," said Bertie. I'd never before heard her voice tremble. I set Duzu on the chair, and I gave May and Bertie a quick hug. 4 buckets were right outside the door. I grabbed 2, and I left 2 for May and Bertie, hoping against hope they wouldn't need them. I didn't let myself say the words until I'd reached the front gate. "I love you," I called. Chapter 35. Smoke hung in the village like a menacing fog. The air was yellow-gray. It hurt to breathe. I started at the riverfront. No Connor. I tried the village hall. Again, nothing. No doubt his father had found him. Connor was probably fine, and yet I couldn't stop thinking, what if? What if? Near the carousel, a bucket brigade was hard at work. A long line of villagers snaked from the fountain to the edge of the woods, where the fire appeared to be heading. The first person in the line scooped out water into the pails, pots, and buckets and passed it down. Meanwhile, 2 other groups dug trenches and cleared brush on the hillside, hoping to contain the fire's spread. Practically every resident seemed to be there. People were sweating and panting, their faces smudged with soot, their cheeks marked with tears. I walked down the line, choking and coughing like everyone else, and finally there he was. When Connor saw me, his grin practically overtook his whole face. "Willodeen!" he cried, as he passed a metal pail to the woman beside him. "My father said he saw you, but I was still worried." He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Really worried." "Everyone's fine," I said. I paused. "Except Quinby. She's disappeared." Connor vanished. His face fell. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." I wanted to say more, but it wasn't the right time. I took my buckets to the fountain, headed to the end of the line, and joined my neighbors in the fight. Our fight. We worked together for hours after the fountain ran dry. We took turns hauling water from the river. When the wind picked up, we covered our faces with handkerchiefs and bandanas. When our hands were blistered from the buckets and shovels, we tied scraps of cloth around our palms. We helped each other because we were all we had. Because we knew that against the brutal, timeless forces of nature, the best we could hope for was a truce. 36. By midnight, the wind had calmed and flames had faded to the swath of glowing embers. Against the full moon, sky skeletons of burnt trees marked the fire's path. A few buildings were damaged, but except for some blistered hands, stinging eyes, and lingering coughs, no one was badly hurt. It was, we all knew, a miracle. Connor and I agreed to meet the next morning, exhausted as we were. Neither of us slept well. As dawn broke, we were already searching for Quinby. We brought Duzu on the off chance his presence might draw her out. Naturally, we started in the hidden grove, since it was our best hope. There was no sign of her, although the number of bubble nests had grown to 11. Connor gazed up at the nests. 11, he marveled. I wish I understood why they keep coming here. Actually, I think I may have figured it out, I said. Connor's mouth dropped open. What? He cried. Why didn't you tell me? I was about to yesterday, then the fire came, and what with losing Quinby and all, I'd been so thrilled about my discovery, but without Quinby there, everything felt hollow. Willodeen, said Connor, this is important. Please, tell me. I motioned him over to the 2 willows where Quinby had spent most of her time digging. Well, it was hard to know where to start. First, I had to figure out the right questions to ask. Why are the hummingbirds only nesting here? What makes these 2 trees so special? Good question. Think about when we started seeing fewer hummingbirds migrating to the village, Connor. Now that I was explaining my ideas, I felt my initial excitement returning. It was around the same time that the village council decided to put a bounty on screechers, right? Connor sat on the rock, hand on his chin, listening intently. That could easily just be coincidence, though. I held up an index finger. Maybe. But it is also a coincidence that hummingbirds are nesting here, where Quinby's been eating, and nowhere else. I knelt next to one of the 2 deep holes Quinby had created. I wish I had my trowel, I said. Better yet, I wish I had Quinby. Reaching down past my elbow, I managed to grab a handful of snails. Look, I said, the further down you dig, the more snails you find. That's why Quinby kept returning to the same holes. She found hundreds of snails here, Connor, maybe more, and ate them all, he joked. I returned the snails and brushed my dirty hands on my coat. I started to wonder what makes these 2 trees and only these 2 trees attractive to the hummingbirds. Could it be because Quinby has eaten so many of the snails near the roots? Maybe having too many snails changes the trees in some important way. Too many? Connor frowned. I stood. Nature likes things in balance. My pa taught me that. Maybe the screechers kept the snail population in check. Connor did not look convinced. So, to test my idea, I said, I conducted an experiment. I guess you'd say I got a bunch of different leaves, including samples from these blue willows, the ones down by the riverfront, and the new grove, to be thorough. And to be thorough, I added some other trees, too. I stopped long enough to cough. My throat still burned from yesterday's smoke. Then I, borrowed, one of Duzu's bubbles. A bubble? Why? Just a hunch. Luck, I suppose. I figured there had to be something special about these 2 trees, something connected to having fewer snails around. It could have been, I don't know, the way the leaves taste or the strength of the branches. It could have been anything. I lifted my shoulders. But since I happened to have a bubble, I started there. Connor cocked his head. And the bubbles wouldn't stick, Connor. Not to any of the other blue willow leaves, not to any of the other tree leaves, just to the leaves from these 2 trees. I paused to catch my breath. I felt busy and hopeful, even confident. Connor stared up at the nests overhead. That has to be it, Willodeen. I still don't understand what the reason is, I added. Do the snails harm the roots? Does that affect the sap in the leaves? But if I'm right, we might fix things by luring screechers back to perchance. They could keep the snails from getting out of control. Connor shook his head. You are amazing. Do you realize that? I shrugged. I feel like Quinby showed me the answer to the puzzle, I said, sighing, and now she's gone. You found the answer, Willodeen, Connor replied with a sad smile. Quinby just provided the appetite. Chapter 37. When we returned to town, the sour smell of smoke hung over everything. The councilors had hastily scheduled a council meeting to discuss fire damage and consider the future. Many people blamed the railroad for causing the fire, but the dry conditions and dragon's size clearly had played a part in it too. In any case, I knew what I had to do. Connor and I walked to the carousel. Like much of the village, it was coated in ash. I sat on the blue unicorn, and Connor leaned on my favorite gold-spotted pony. Do you think we'll ever see Quinby again? I asked, stifling another cough. Bertie and May had given me a foul-tasting elixir that morning to soothe my throat. Connor stroked Duzu, who was perched on his shoulder. Do you want an honest answer, Willodeen, or do you want me to lie? Lying would be nice, but tell me the truth. I doubt we'll ever see her again. I wiped away a tear. But whatever she was, wherever she is, it's a good thing we had her here with us for a while. It never would have happened if you hadn't given me that puzzler. Connor shook his head. We don't know that. Well, it was certainly quite a coincidence. People were already streaming into the hall for the council meeting. It looked like the entire village had shown up, men and women, old and young. To my surprise, I saw Bertie and May slowly climbing the steps. I called out, and they both waved. You know, school will be starting up again soon, Connor said. I know. It's not so bad, really. Connor wiped some ash off the gold pony's mane. Course, it'd be better with you there, he added, avoiding my gaze. I really don't like crowds, I reminded him. Or, I grinned, you know, people. But you do like learning. True, I admitted. Bertie and May say it's up to me. They seem to think I'm too stubborn to argue with. You? Stubborn? Ha! Connor teased. My father says I don't have a choice. He's sort of the opposite of Bertie and May. He says he just wants what's best for you, I think. The worry on his face yesterday when he didn't know where you were. He loves you so much. I know. Connor reached up to scratch Duzu's ear. All that worrying seems like the worst part of being an adult to me. Not to mention all those meetings, Connor grinned. I suppose it'll be our turn soon. Soon enough. He pointed to the hall. A few stragglers were still arriving. You ready? I hopped off the unicorn. You know, I said, surprising myself. I think I am. Chapter 38. By the time Thaddeus Vilner slammed down his gavel, the room was packed. Yesterday, he said, his voice solemn, we saw the best of ourselves, working to fight a common enemy, caring for each other, his voice cracked. We've fought other fires, faced other problems, but this time we worked together in a way I've never seen before. The crowd murmured and nodded. My grandmother, rest her soul, continued Thaddeus, had a saying. He paused to blow his nose. Thaddy, she would say, she called me Thaddy, even when I was a grown man. Thaddy, with enough whispers, you can make a roar. Yesterday, our beloved village of perchance managed to roar. The mood was different from the last meeting I'd attended. Villagers stood in a long line, waiting for their chance to speak. But they were patient and kind to each other. I heard plenty of worry and fear. I saw some tears and even heard some laughter. But the fresh experience of yet another fire seemed to have left most people feeling grateful and humbled. Everything and anything was discussed. Clearing the land near the railroad tracks, creating a volunteer fire brigade, planting trees that resisted burning and didn't require too much water. It wasn't just the fires. People talked about building a new school, about recruiting a doctor to live in the town, about building and growing and improving. And almost everyone talked about the fair. Would it happen? Had anyone seen more hummingbirds? Was there any hope at all? I stood at the very back of the line, the last to speak, and the youngest, and I waited my turn. When Thaddeus saw me, he groaned. Ah, he said. Would this be about the Screechers yet again? We have an awful lot to think about, as you can see, my dear. Perhaps another time? I blinked, flustered. This will only take a minute, I said. We're all weary, said Thaddeus, as a baby wailed, and the little ones are restless. We've no time to talk about those smelly monsters of yours. Connor stood. Sir, he said loudly, you'll want to hear what Willodeen has to say. Trust me, we all need to hear it. Thaddeus narrowed his eyes. The chair didn't recognize you, boy. He waved his gavel. Ready to adjourn? But Connor's father held up a warning hand. Thaddeus, he said, give Willodeen a chance. Miss Rossett nodded. Yes, she said. Goodness knows we've heard plenty from all the adults. Thaddeus considered. After a moment, he slumped in his chair. Fine, he said, dropping his gavel on the table. Speak your piece. And so I did. I told everyone what I'd observed. I told them about the hidden grove, about a screecher who dined on peacock snails. I did not tell them how she'd come into my life. About the 11 humming-bear nests that Connor and I had discovered. When I mentioned the nest, the entire room burst into applause. People hugged and cheered and raised their fists. I looked over at Connor and we shared a smile. After the group calmed down, I explained, best as I could, how screechers and hummingbears and blue willows all needed each other. even if it wasn't easy for us to see or understand. I said they were a community, same as we were. At this, some people stirred. I heard murmurs shifting in seats and sighs. The same as us, someone demanded. The same as us? I noticed a gray-templed man, nattily dressed, standing to my left. I had seen him before. It was James McLachlan, owner of a nearby mill. Are you actually suggesting, child, that a foul beast deserves the same regard as a human being? He asked. He's right. We aren't animals, a woman yelled, and others muttered their agreement. I gulped. I knew what was in my heart, but turning that into words, coherent, grown-up words, perhaps that was one more than I could manage. Behind me, I heard others standing, more angry folks, no doubt. Was this how screechers felt? Cornered, outnumbered. One touch of nature makes the whole world kin. I spun around, and it was May, declaiming with all her theatrical flair. That's Shakespeare, she added, in case you were wondering. Bertie stood too. Let Willodeen speak, she said. It wasn't a request. It was a demand. And be sure you listen. Never had she seemed taller or more invincible. The room fell silent, shocked, no doubt, by the audacity of these two old women. I was shaking from head to toe. I took a breath. I found my voice. I said that we were all connected, people and plants and fish and birds and, yes, even screechers. I told everyone that it would take time and work to undo what we'd done. That even if we brought screechers back, nothing would change overnight. That we probably wouldn't have much of a fair this year, maybe even for many years. And then I told them one last thing. I told them that nature knows more than we do, and she probably always will. Chapter 39. When the meeting ended, Connor and I led a group of villagers, including all the counselors, to the hidden grove. Another nest had already been added in our brief absence. It felt odd having all those people crowded into the space where Connor and I had spent so much time. But the joy their faces made it all worthwhile. Several people openly wept at the sight of those miraculous nests and their gentle residents. Connor walked me back home. We didn't talk at all. We didn't need to. I just waved goodbye to him from the front door of the cottage when he shouted, "Wait, Willodeen!" I returned to the gate. "What's wrong?" He pointed to his shoulder. "You almost forgot something." Duzu was curled in a tight ball, dozing away. He might as well have been cuddled on my pillow. Connor ran his index finger along the hummingbear's back. Duzu opened one eye, then closed it. "He's snoring," I pointed out. Connor smiled. "He only snores when he feels safe," I said. "Wake up, Duzu," said Connor. "It's time to go home." "No." I took a step back and shook my head. I think I want you to take him, Connor. Let's face it, he much prefers your company." My words hung in the air. I hadn't realized I was going to say them. Was I making a terrible mistake? Giving a gift was almost as bad as accepting one. It made you obliged. It created a connection. Still, Connor had given me Quinby, in a way, and Duzu adored Connor. It only seemed fair. I stroked Duzu. "Do you want to stay with Connor?" I asked. Duzu yawned, glancing at us both with heavy-lidded eyes. He replied with a firm, "Coo." Was that a yes, a no, or a maybe? I asked Connor. Actually, it was a yes. Of course it was. I made myself look Connor in the eyes. I saw gratitude there. But I didn't feel beholden. I didn't feel weighed down. I just felt glad. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'll see you both plenty," I said. And suddenly I realized that might actually be true. Chapter 40. That night, I couldn't sleep. I missed the soothing snores of Duzu and Quinby.
I closed my eyes. I saw fire raging, smoke without end, forests forever changed. I opened my eyes. Moon. Shoes, notebooks, ceiling. I closed my eyes again. I saw the hidden grove. I saw the adults listening to a child. To me. Eyes open. Quinby's box sat empty. Juzu's spot was cold and bare. Once more I closed my eyes. I saw Duzu asleep on Connor's pillow, dreaming of a world where he could still slip through the clouds. I smiled, and then I fell asleep.